Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining with us again this morning. I just want to say thank you to Graham and Joanne for that beautiful prayer, those beautiful prayers, and they've really brought us to a place this morning where now we're ready to dig in to God's Word, to this story about Moses. It's in our series on Moses being fearful and faithful, and today our story comes from Exodus chapter 3, and it's all about Moses' encounter with God in the wilderness. So before we dig into there, I want to talk a little bit about Moses' backstory. In Exodus chapter 2, we read, "One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand." And then we come to the first verse of chapter 3 in our story today. "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God." Here we have Moses, who is really uniquely representative of the children of Israel. Moses is Hebrew by blood. He has received from his ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the idea of one God, which is very unique to the places around. Most other nations believed in many, many gods, and yet he had received this tradition, this belief in one God. But Moses was nurtured in the cradle of Egypt, in the home of the daughter of Pharaoh. And much like the people, the Hebrews of that day, they had lived there for 400 years. They were Hebrew by blood. They had received this tradition, this belief and faith in one God, and yet they had grown up and lived their entire lives in Egypt, surrounded by the culture and the thinking of Egypt. So here's Moses, and he receives this incredible sense of injustice. He looks around and he sees the injustice being done to his own people, the Hebrews, and he rises up and tries to do something about it. Maybe Moses thought he had all the answers, or maybe it was just an impulsive action. Whatever it was, it failed miserably, and Moses finds himself in the middle of the wilderness. He finds himself in the wilderness both physically and figuratively. Moses, he has lots of time and space to think about, to wonder about his past, about the events as they had unfolded, and about his own sense of justice and how that was supposed to have played out and what went so terribly wrong. It was a place where Moses could wonder about this one God and why his people, the Hebrews, were in such a place of oppression. The other nations that believed in many gods had it easy. You know, they could just say, well, this God was fighting with that God, and this explains why things didn't go the way that they should. But when you believe in one God, you wonder about the suffering. You wonder about the oppression that you see when you look around. So Moses, as he's wandering around, he doesn't even have his own sheep. He's leading his father-in-law's sheep through the wilderness. He doesn't own any land. He doesn't have his own sheep. He doesn't have he's not surrounded by his own people and his own culture. He's very much alone. And as he wanders around, you can imagine that the question that is pulling at him, that he's struggling with, and that he cries out to God with, is one that we can all relate to. I can imagine that Moses might have stopped and said, "God, don't you even care? Don't you even see the oppression against your people that you say you love? Don't you care?" Moses was wise to ask that question, to carry it around with him in the wilderness. Often in our hurry to defend God from this audacious question, "Don't you care?" we throw each other in the river. We minimize the suffering of others when we defend God. In fact, we become like Job's friends. We might say, well, it was brought on by your own actions. You sinned or you failed, and so this is what happens. Or we might say, well, God had an important lesson for you, and so he allowed you to go through this hard time. And I think that we minimize the suffering and the sorrow of others when we do that. I'm thankful for every bit of understanding that I have received as a result of my suffering, but it doesn't make it worth it. It's not worth it, and it doesn't explain why it happened. I've learned that I must receive the good with the bad. I must enjoy and appreciate the understanding that I've received without trying to use it to explain the evil. I think these are some of the things that Moses was wrestling with as he walked around in the wilderness, and he carried around these questions. Because Moses would see lots of inconsistencies as he wandered around in the wilderness, wouldn't he? Moses would see flowers, beautiful flowers, growing up in this arid and dry desert, maybe on hard-packed mountain paths. He would experience the coolness of fresh spring water under the unbearable desert sun. And Moses would witness every spring these sheep giving birth and these newborn lambs frolicking and running around playful. We just got a new kitten at my house. And I'm not a big pet person. I'm actually a little bit allergic to cats, and so I have to keep my distance. But I can't describe to you the joy that wells up in my being as I watch this kitten frolicking and playing around, climbing on things, exploring, and just enjoying life. There's something beautiful about that, and it impacts my heart. I think that things impacted Moses' heart as well. Moses was starting to realize that it wasn't so important to figure God out, to understand why things were happening, but it was important to ask the question, to hold them up and allow God to carry the questions. So as we come to this story, Moses encountering God in the burning bush, I wanted to ask a couple of questions. First of all, what does this story show us about Moses? And then what does it show us about God? So Exodus 3, verses 2 and 3, it says, "There the angel of the Lord appeared to him," to Moses, "in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up." Moses was looking for God. He was wandering around in the wilderness, in the desert. How many bushes on fire had he seen? Probably dozens. It was something that happens in the desert sun with this very combustible material sitting in the heat of the day. They probably caught on fire and burned themselves out. Many, many times Moses would have seen this. What caused him to go over and look? What caught his attention? Well, it says the bush didn't burn up. It didn't stop, so Moses noticed it. But what made him go see? I believe that Moses was open, searching, looking for God, wanting an encounter with God. We had Psalm 42 read this morning. Thank you, Luke. It was beautiful. And in Psalm 42, some of the cries, what was going on in Moses' heart is echoed in this psalm. Verses 1 and 2 say, "As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When can I go and meet with God?" I think carrying these questions around and asking God, "Don't you even care?" far from pushing Moses away from God, far from causing Moses to reject God altogether, it actually ignited a hunger and a thirst in Moses to find God, to have an encounter, to really get to know who this God is. And I would say that faith and doubt are so closely linked together that we can't have one without the other. And when we ask these hard questions, when we ask them without requiring an answer, but we just say them out loud, it does actually help to build a desire for an encounter with God within us. I believe this is what happened with Moses. So what does this tell us about God? Let's look at the next few verses. "When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, 'Moses, Moses.' And Moses said, 'Here I am.' 'Do not come any closer,' God said. 'Take off your sandals, for the place you are standing is holy ground.' Then he said, 'I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob." At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. You know, God doesn't impose himself on Moses. He doesn't do something so miraculous that Moses doesn't have the option to interact, to choose to go over and see. God does something very subtle. He calls to Moses from something that Moses would have witnessed daily in the wilderness. And yet, when Moses goes, when Moses turns aside to see, God calls his name, Moses, Moses. God, it says in these verses, God waits to see what Moses will do. And when he sees that Moses comes to see, that's when he speaks. And then he tells Moses who he is. He gives Moses some context. He says, "I am the God of your fathers. I am your God, Moses." And he talks about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And I think in this, God was telling Moses a little bit what he was going to be requiring of him. Now, if you remember, when God called Abraham, he called Abraham to go from everything that he knew to the wilderness. He called Abraham to go into the unknown. And if you remember in Jacob's story, God called Jacob to go back from the wilderness to deal with unfinished business, to go and reconcile with his brother and to make things right, and to go back to where he had left. And it's interesting as we see Moses' story going forward. God calls Moses to go back and deal with unfinished business. And then he calls Moses and the entire nation, the children of Israel, to leave the place that they had known for 400 years, and to go into the unknown, to go into a place he was calling them. So God gives Moses some context here. He responds to Moses, and then he tells him who he is. And I think the most beautiful part comes next, because God actually confirms to Moses that he had been listening. You know, as Moses was wandering around in the desert asking God, "Don't you even care?" Now this part where God speaks, God answers the cry of Moses' heart. Let's read it. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." You know, I love how God answers Moses here, a question that Moses maybe hadn't even asked out loud, certainly hadn't asked within this encounter that we've read today, and yet God says, "I have indeed seen, I have heard." God heard Moses' prayers, his questions, when he said, "Don't you even care?" God heard, and he said, "Yes, Moses, I do care." You know, there's many times as a mother that my children come to me with things that I can't do anything about. I can't fix, In fact, I often have joked with my coworkers, when I had coworkers, that the definition of being a mother is feeling pain for your child that you can't fix. And, you know, I've often said that being a mother is the closest thing I can understand to what it must be like to be God, to be a loving God. And I'm not saying that God can't fix, but God doesn't fix everything. And I'm not here to answer why or to give any explanations about that. But as a mother, when I can't fix my child's hurt, I do the one thing that is the most important, that is the most beautiful, is that I let them know that they are seen and known, and that their hurt matters, and that I've heard them. And this changes everything. I've witnessed it over and over again. I don't have anything to offer, but I hear them, and it helps them. It helps them to be able to fight their own battles, to find whatever it is they need inside, that they can rise to the occasion, that they can rise up and meet the problem that's facing them. And so here's God saying, I see you. I hear you. And you might wonder, well, what's God going to do about it? But when I think of God saying, I will come down, how is it that he puts it? So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians. You know, God is everywhere. We know God is everywhere. What did he mean? I have come down. Well, God is going to enter this story in a new way, in a way that we hadn't seen before, in a way that they hadn't seen in over 400 years. God was going to come down and enter their story. You know, we celebrate our own story of when God came down. And Olivia read for us from the message in John 1, where we learn about God coming down, Jesus being born. It says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. That didn't mean that God wasn't here before. It doesn't mean that Jesus, that the Christ, the Word, wasn't here before, because in John chapter 1, verse 1, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But it means that God was coming in a new way. He was coming to our rescue, to our help. And I think that what I love about God coming in Jesus is that God enters that story. Jesus becomes the story. He enters the story. And one of the last things that we hear Jesus say on the cross is, it's really an echo of our own question. God, don't you care? Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it is an echo of the question that we have had. And so we see Jesus entering our story to the point where he asks our question. You know, Jesus dies, and we're left wondering, what kind of answer is that? What kind of answer is that when Jesus asks, don't you care, God? And then he dies? You know, if we left it there, we would be so miserable. Jesus didn't stay in the grave. He was raised again, and he was with us. Now, I don't want to jump too far ahead because we're still in the story of Moses. And in Moses' story, God has more to tell him. Let's read what God told Moses. Because God's going to make Moses a promise. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. What's God's promise? I will be with you. You know, I think it's interesting that God's assurance to Moses, who is understandably terrified. The last time I tried to fix this, God, I messed up royally. I killed someone. I became the problem. I don't know if I want to go back there. And God makes him a promise. He says, I will be with you. You know, I love that God's promise isn't, there will be no more suffering. God doesn't say that. And God's promise isn't, your enemies will be destroyed. No, that's not his promise. His promise is, I will be with you. You know, in God being with the children of Israel on this journey, he creates for them an opportunity. He invites them into redemption. Because redemption is a process that allows me to join the procession out of bondage. When I join that procession, I am able to hear the voice of God above all the other voices. The voice of God that says, you are my beloved, not you are a slave. And the fact that the children of Israel were God's beloved, the fact that you are God's beloved, has never changed. It didn't change during the years that they were oppressed. We don't understand it, but it didn't change. They were God's beloved all along. And so now God enables them to join in this procession out of bondage and reclaim who they are, who they always have been, which is God's beloved. We have our own promise from Jesus, and it takes on the same words, I will be with you. I'd like to read it. It's from Matthew 28, verses 16 to 20. It says, then the 11 disciples, this is after the resurrection, It says, "Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age.'" God makes a promise to Moses, "I will be with you." Jesus makes a promise to us, "I am with you." And he asks us to do something. Just as the children of Israel couldn't magically just be transported out of Egypt. They had to walk. They had to take step by step. God asks us to do something to work out our own redemption, our own rescue from bondage. He says, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations." You know, in making disciples, we are recognizing the humanity, the belovedness of everyone else, of each other. And in doing that, we actually remind ourselves of our own belovedness. Our rescue comes in the making disciples, the recognizing the humanity and the belovedness of all of those around us is actually our own rescue. We're going to end this morning with a song. And some of the words go like this: "You give life, you are love, you bring light to the darkness. You give hope, you restore every heart that is broken." God doesn't promise us no suffering. He doesn't promise us that all of our enemies are going to be destroyed in an instant. But he does promise us hope, restoration, and he brings light right into the darkness. I hope that this morning you will be encouraged as you ask the difficult questions. Don't be afraid to ask, "God, don't you care?" Thank you.